Philosophy of economics. Philosophy of economics consists of inquiries concerning a. Rational choice, b. the appraisal of economic outcomes, institutions, and processes, and c. the ontology of economic phenomena, and the possibilities of acquiring knowledge of them. Although these inquiries overlap in many ways, it is useful to divide philosophy of economics in this way into three subject matters which can be regarded respectively as branches of action theory, ethics, or normative social and political philosophy, and philosophy of science. Economic theories of rationality, welfare, and social choice defend substantive philosophical theses often informed by relevant philosophical literature, and of evident interest to those interested in action theory, philosophical psychology, and social and political philosophy. Economics is of particular interest to those interested in epistemology and philosophy of science, both because of its detailed peculiarities, and because it possesses many of the overt features of the natural sciences, while its object consists of social phenomena. 1. Introduction. What is economics? 1.1 The emergence of economics and of economies. 1.2 Contemporary economics and its several schools. 2. 6 Central methodological problems. 2.1 Positive versus normative economics. 2.2 Reasons versus causes. 2.3 Social scientific naturalism. 2.4 Abstraction, idealization, and ceteris paribus clauses in economics. 2.5 Causation in economics and econometrics. 2.6 Structure and strategy of economics, paradigms, and research programs. 3. Inexactness, ceteris paribus clauses, and unrealistic assumptions. 3.1 Classical economics, and the method a priori. 3.2 Friedman, and the defense of unrealistic assumptions. 4. Contemporary directions in economic methodology. 4.1 Popperian approaches. 4.2 The rhetoric of economics. 4.3 Realism in economic methodology. 4.4 Economic methodology and social studies of science. 4.5 Detailed contemporary studies. 5. Rational choice theory. 5.1 Individual rationality. 5.2 Collective rationality and social choice. 5.3 Game theory. 6. Economics and ethics. 6.1 Welfare. 6.2 Efficiency. 6.3 Other directions in normative economics. 7. Conclusions. Bibliography. Economic methodology. Ethics and economics. Rationality. Other works cited, academic tools, other internet resources, related entries. 1. Introduction. What is economics? Both the definition and the precise domain of economics are subjects of controversy within philosophy of economics. At first glance, the difficulties in defining economics may not appear serious. Economics is, after all, concerned with aspects of the production, exchange, distribution, and consumption of commodities. But this claim and the terms it contains are vague, and it is arguable that economics is relevant to a great deal more. It helps to approach the question, what is economics? Historically, before turning to comments on contemporary features of the discipline. 1.1 The emergence of economics and of economies. Philosophical reflection on economics is ancient, but the conception of the economy as a distinct object of study dates back only to the 18th century. Aristotle addresses some problems that most would recognize as pertaining to economics, mainly as problems concerning how to manage a household. Scholastic philosophers addressed ethical questions concerning economic behavior, and they condemned usury, that is, the taking of interest on money. With the increasing importance of trade and of nation-states in the early modern period, mercantilist philosophers and pamphleteers were largely concerned with the balance of trade and the regulation of the currency. There was an increasing recognition of the complexities of the financial management of the state, and of the possibility that the way that the state taxed and acted influenced the production of wealth. In the early modern period, those who reflected on the sources of a country's wealth recognized that the annual harvest, the quantities of goods manufactured, and the products of mines and fisheries depend on facts about nature, individual labor and enterprise, and state and social regulations. Trade also seemed advantageous, at least if the terms were good enough. It took no conceptual leap to recognize that manufacturing and farming could be improved, and that some taxes and tariffs might be less harmful to productive activities than others. But to formulate the idea that there is such a thing as the economy with regularities that can be investigated requires a bold further step. In order for there to be an object of inquiry, there must be regularities in production and exchange, and for the inquiry to be non-trivial, these regularities must go beyond what is obvious to the producers, consumers, and exchangers themselves. Only in the 18th century, most clearly illustrated by the work of Cantillon, the physiocrats, David Hume, and especially Adam Smith, does one find the idea that there are laws to be discovered that govern the complex set of interactions that produce and distribute consumption goods, and the resources and tools that produce them. Backhouse 2002. Crucial to the possibility of a social object of scientific inquiry is the idea of tracing out the unintended consequences of the actions of individuals. Thus, for example, Hume traces the rise in prices and the temporary increase in economic activity that follow an increase in currency to the perceptions and actions of individuals who first spend the additional currency, 1752. In spending their additional gold imported from abroad, traders do not intend to increase the price level, but that is what they do nevertheless. Adam Smith expands and perfects this insight, and offers a systematic inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. From his account of the demise of feudalism, 1776, Book 2, Chapter 4, to his famous discussion of the invisible hand, Smith emphasizes unintended consequences. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand, to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. 1776, Book 4, Chapter 2. The existence of unobvious regularities, which are the unintended consequences of individual choices, gives rise to an object of scientific investigation. One can distinguish the domain of economics from the domain of other social scientific inquiries, either by specifying some set of causal factors, or by specifying some range of phenomena. The phenomena with which economists are concerned are production, consumption, distribution, and exchange, particularly via markets. But since so many different causal factors are relevant to these, from the laws of thermodynamics and metallurgy to accounts of geography and social norms, even the laws governing digestion, economics cannot be distinguished from other inquiries only by the phenomena it studies. Some reference to a set of central causal factors is needed. Thus, for example, John Stuart Mill maintained that political economy is concerned with such of the phenomena of the social state as take place in consequence of the pursuit of wealth. It makes entire abstraction of every other human passion or motive, except those which may be regarded as perpetually antagonizing principles to the desire of wealth, namely aversion to labor, and desire of the present enjoyment of costly indulgences. 1843, Book 6, Chapter 9, Section 3. In Mill's view, economics is mainly concerned with the consequences of individual pursuit of tangible wealth, though it takes some account of less significant motives such as aversion to labor. Mill takes it for granted that individuals act rationally in their pursuit of wealth and luxury and avoidance of labor, rather than in a disjointed or erratic way, but he has no theory of consumption, or explicit theory of rational economic choice, and his theory of resource allocation is rather thin. Such theories were developed only in the wake of the so-called neoclassical or marginalist revolution, which linked choice and price of some object of consumption not to its total utility, but to its marginal utility. For example, water is obviously extremely useful, but in much of the world it is plentiful enough that another glass more or less matters little to an agent. So water is cheap. Early neoclassical economists such as Jevons held that agents make consumption choices so as to maximize their own happiness, 1871. This implies that they distribute their expenditures so that $1 worth of water or porridge or upholstery makes the same contribution to their happiness. The marginal utility of $1 worth of each good is the same. In the 20th century, economists stripped this general theory of rationality of its hedonistic clothing. Pareto 1909, Hicks and Allen 1934. Rather than supposing that all consumption choices can be ranked by how much they promote an agent's happiness, economists focused on the ranking itself. All that they suppose concerning evaluations is that agents are able consistently to rank the alternatives they face. This is equivalent to supposing first that rankings are complete, that is, for any two alternatives X and Y, that the agent may evaluate or choose. Either the agent ranks X above Y, prefers X to Y, or the agent prefers Y to X, or the agent is indifferent. Second, economists suppose that agents' rankings of alternatives, preferences, are transitive. To say that an agent's preferences are transitive is to claim that if the agent prefers X to Y and Y to Z, then the agent prefers X to Z, with similar claims concerning indifference and combinations of indifference and preference. Though there are further technical conditions to extend the theory to infinite sets of alternatives, and to capture further plausible rationality conditions concerning gambles, economists generally subscribe to a view of a rational agent as possessing complete and transitive preferences, and as choosing among the feasible alternatives whatever he or she most prefers. Attempts have also been made in the theory of revealed preference to eliminate all reference to subjective preference, or to define preference in terms of choices. Samuelson 1947, Houthaker 1950, Little 1957, Sen 1971, 1973, Hausman 2011, Chapter 3. In clarifying the view of rationality that characterizes economic agents, economists have for the most part continued to distinguish economics from other social inquiries by the content of the motives or preferences with which it is concerned. So even though an agent may for example seek happiness through asceticism, or may rationally prefer to sacrifice all his or her worldly goods to a political cause, economists have supposed that such preferences are rare and unimportant to economics. What economists are concerned with are the phenomena deriving not just from rationality, but from rationality coupled with a desire for wealth, and larger bundles of goods and services. Economists have flirted with a less substantive characterization of individual motivation, and with a more expansive view of the domain of economics. In his influential monograph, An Essay on the Nature and Significance of Economic Science, Lionel Robbins defined economics as the science which studies human behavior, as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. 1932, page 15. According to Robbins, economics is not concerned with production, exchange, distribution, or consumption as such. It is instead concerned with that aspect of all human action. Although Robbins' definition helps one to understand efforts to apply economic concepts, models, and techniques to other subject matters such as the analysis of voting behavior and legislation, it seems evident that economics maintains its connection to a traditional domain. 1.2 Contemporary economics and its several schools. Contemporary economics is extremely diverse. There are many schools and many branches. Even so-called orthodox or mainstream economics has many variants. Some mainstream economics is highly theoretical, though most of it is applied, and relies on only rather rudimentary theory. Both theoretical and applied work can be distinguished as microeconomics or macroeconomics. Microeconomics focuses on relations among individuals, though firms and households often count as honorary individuals, and little is said about the demand of particular individuals for specific commodities, as opposed to aggregate demand for those commodities. Individuals have complete and transitive preferences that govern their choices. Consumers prefer more commodities to fewer, and have diminishing marginal rates of substitution, i.e. they will pay less for units of a commodity when they already have lots of it than when they have little of it. Firms attempt to maximize profits in the face of diminishing returns, holding fixed all the inputs into production except one. Output increases when there is more of the remaining input, but at a diminishing rate. Economists idealize and suppose that in competitive markets, firms and individuals cannot influence prices, but economists are also interested in strategic interactions in which the rational choices of separate individuals are interdependent. Game theory, which is devoted to the study of strategic interactions, is of growing importance both in theoretical and applied microeconomics. Economists model the outcome of the profit-maximizing activities of firms and the attempts of consumers to best satisfy their preferences as an equilibrium in which there is no excess demand on any market. What this means is that anyone who wants to buy anything at the going market price is able to do so. There is no excess demand, and unless a good is free, there is no excess supply. Macroeconomics grapples with the relations among economic aggregates, such as relations between the money supply and the rate of interest or the rate of growth, focusing especially on problems concerning the business cycle and the influence of monetary and fiscal policy on economic outcomes. Many mainstream economists would like to unify macroeconomics and microeconomics, but few economists are satisfied with the attempts that have been made to do so, especially via so-called representative agents. Gurman 1992, Hoover 2001a. Econometrics is a third main branch of economics devoted to the empirical estimation, elaboration, and to some extent testing of specific microeconomic and macroeconomic models, but see Summers 1991 and Hoover 1994. Macroeconomics is immediately relevant to economic policy, and hence, and unsurprisingly, subject to much more heated and politically charged controversy than microeconomics or econometrics. Schools of macroeconomics include Keynesians and New Keynesians monetarists, New Classical Economics Rational Expectations Theory, Begg 1982, Carter and Maddock 1984, Hoover 1988, Minford and Peel 1983, and Real Business Cycle Theories, Kydland and Prescott 1991, 1994, Cent 1998. Branches of mainstream economics are also devoted to specific questions concerning growth, finance, employment, agriculture, housing, natural resources, international trade, and so forth. Within orthodox economics, there are also many different approaches, such as agency theory, Jensen and Meckling 1976, Fama 1980, the Chicago School, Becker 1976, Fowler Public Choice Theory, Brennan, and Buchanan 1985, Buchanan 1975. Although mainstream economics is dominant and demands the most attention, there are many other schools. Austrian economists accept orthodox views of choices and constraints, but they emphasize uncertainty and question whether one should regard outcomes as equilibria, and they are skeptical about the value of mathematical modeling. Buchanan and Van Berg 1989, Dolan 1976, Kiersner 1976, Mises 1949, 1978, 1981, Rothbard 1957, Wiseman 1983, Becky 2010. Traditional institutionalist economists question the value of abstract general theorizing, Duggar 1979, Wilbur and Harrison 1978, Wisman and Rosansky 1991, Hodgson 2000, Delorme 2010. They emphasize the importance of generalizations concerning norms and behavior within particular institutions. Applied work in institutional economics is sometimes very similar to applied orthodox economics. More recent work in economics, which is also called institutionalist, attempts to explain features of institutions by emphasizing the costs of transactions, the inevitable incompleteness of contracts, and the problems principals face in monitoring and directing their agents. Coase 1937, Williamson 1985, Mackey et al. 1993, North 1990, Brousseau and Gluckin 2008. Marxian economists traditionally articulated and developed Karl Marx's economic theories, but recently many Marxian economists have revised traditional Marxian concepts and themes with tools borrowed from orthodox economic theory. Morishima 1973, Remmer 1981, 1982. There are also socio-economists, Etzioni 1988, behavioral economists, Kahneman and Tversky 2000, Kammerer 2003, Kammerer et al. 2003, Thaler 1994, Benner and Putterman 1998, Winter 1962, Post-Keynesians, Dow 1985, Kriegel 1976, Evolutionary Economists, Witt 2008, Hodgson and Knudsen 2010, Vroman 2009, Neo-Ricardians, Sraffa 1960, Passanetti 1981, Roncaglia 1978, and even neuroeconomists, Kammerer 2007, Kammerer et al. 2005, Kammerer et al. 2008, Lowenstein et al. 2008, Rosticini 2005, 2008. Economics is not one homogeneous enterprise. 2. 6 central methodological problems. Although the different branches and schools of economics raise a wide variety of epistemological and ontological issues concerning economics, 6 problems have been central to methodological reflection. In this philosophical sense, concerning economics, 2.1 Positive versus normative economics. Policymakers look to economics to guide policy, and it seems inevitable that even the most esoteric issues in theoretical economics may bear on some people's material interests. The extent to which economics bears on, and may be influenced by normative concerns, raises methodological questions about the relationships between a positive science concerning facts, and a normative inquiry into values, and what ought to be. Most economists and methodologists believe that there is a reasonably clear distinction between facts and values, between what is and what ought to be, and they believe that most of economics should be regarded as a positive science that helps policymakers choose means to accomplish their ends, though it does not bear on the choice of ends itself. This view is questionable for several reasons. Mungen 2006, Houseman and McPherson 2006. First, economists have to interpret and articulate the incomplete specifications of goals and constraints provided by policymakers. Matchlap 1969b. Second, economic science is a human activity, and like all human activities, it is governed by values. Those values need not be the same as the values that influence economic policy, but it is debatable whether the values that govern the activity of economists can be sharply distinguished from the values that govern policymakers. Third, much of economics is built around a normative theory of rationality. One can question whether the values implicit in such theories are sharply distinguishable from the values that govern policies. For example, it may be difficult to hold a maximizing view of individual rationality, while at the same time insisting that social policy should resist maximizing growth, wealth, or welfare in the name of freedom, rights, or equality. Fourth, people's views of what is right and wrong are, as a matter of fact, influenced by their beliefs about how people in fact behave. There is evidence that studying theories that depict individuals as self-interested leads people to regard self-interested behavior more favorably, and to become more self-interested. Marwell and Ames 1981, Frank et al. 1993. Finally, people's judgments are clouded by their interests. Since economic theories bear so centrally on people's interests, there are bound to be ideological biases at work in the discipline. Marx 1867. Preface. The current, 2012, bitter polemics in macroeconomics testify to the influence of ideology. 2.2 Reasons versus causes. Orthodox theoretical microeconomics is as much a theory of rational choices as it a theory that explains and predicts economic outcomes. Since virtually all economic theories that discuss individual choices take individuals as acting for reasons, and thus in some way rational, questions about the role that views of rationality and reasons should play in economics are of general importance. Economists are typically concerned with the aggregate results of individual choices rather than with particular individuals, but their theories in fact offer both causal explanations for why individuals choose as they do and accounts of the reasons for their choices. See also the entry on methodological individualism. Explanations in terms of reasons have several features that distinguish them from explanations in terms of causes. Reasons justify the actions they explain, and indeed so-called external reasons, Williams 1981, only justify action without purporting to explain it. Reasons can be evaluated, and they are responsive to criticism. Reasons, unlike causes, must be intelligible to those for whom they are reasons. On grounds such as these, many philosophers have questioned whether explanations of human action can be causal explanations. Von Wright 1971, Winch 1958. Yet merely giving a reason, even an extremely good reason, fails to explain an agent's action if the reason was not in fact effective. Someone might, for example, start attending church regularly and give as his reason a concern with salvation. But others might suspect that this agent is deceiving himself, and that the minister's attractive daughter is in fact responsible for his renewed interest in religion. Donald Davidson, 1963, argued that what distinguishes the reasons that explain an action from the reasons that fail to explain it are that the former are also causes of the action. Although the account of rationality within economics differs in some ways from the folk psychology people tacitly invoke in everyday explanations of actions, many of the same questions carry over. Rosenberg 1976, Chapter 5, 1980, Hausman 2011. An additional difference between explanations in terms of reasons and explanations in terms of causes, which some economists have emphasized, is that the beliefs and preferences that explain actions may depend on mistakes and ignorance. 1935. As a first approximation, economists can abstract from such difficulties caused by the intentionality of belief and desire. They thus often assume that people have perfect information about all the relevant facts. In that way, theorists need not worry about what people's beliefs are. If one assumes that people have perfect information, one assumes that they believe and expect whatever the facts are. But once one goes beyond this first approximation, difficulties arise which have no parallel in the natural sciences. Choice depends on how things look from the inside, which may be very different from the actual state of affairs. Consider, for example, the stock market. The true value of a stock depends on the future profits of the company, which are of course uncertain. In 2006, house prices in the U.S. were extremely inflated. But whether they were too high depended, at least in the short run, on what people believe. No matter how overpriced homes might be, they were excellent investments, if tomorrow or next month somebody would be willing to pay even more for them. Economists disagree about how significant this subjectivity is. Members of the Austrian school argue that these differences are of great importance, and sharply distinguish theorizing about economics from theorizing about any of the natural sciences. Buchanan and Van Berg 1989, von Mises 1981. 2.3 Social scientific naturalism. Of all the social sciences, economics most closely resembles the natural sciences. Economic theories have been axiomatized, and articles and books of economics are full of theorems. Of all the social sciences, only economics boasts an ersatz Nobel Prize. Economics is thus a test case for those concerned with the extent of the similarities between the natural and social sciences. Those who have wondered whether social sciences must differ fundamentally from the natural sciences seem to have been concerned mainly with three questions. Are there fundamental differences between the structure or concepts of theories and explanations in the natural and social sciences? Some of these issues were already mentioned in the discussion above of reasons versus causes. Are there fundamental differences in goals? Philosophers and economists have argued that in addition to, or instead of the predictive and explanatory goals of the natural sciences, the social sciences should aim at providing us with understanding. Weber and others have argued that the social sciences should provide us with an understanding from the inside, that we should be able to empathize with the reactions of the agents, and to find what happens understandable. Weber 1904, Knight 1935, Matchlap 1969. This, and the closely related recognition that explanations cite reasons rather than just causes, seems to introduce an element of subjectivity into the social sciences that is not found in the natural sciences. Owing to the importance of human choices, or perhaps free will, are social phenomena too irregular to be captured within a framework of laws and theories. Given human free will, perhaps human behavior is intrinsically unpredictable and not subject to any laws. But there are, in fact, many regularities in human action, and given the enormous causal complexity characterizing some natural systems, the natural sciences must cope with many irregularities, too. 2.4 Abstraction, idealization, and ceteris paribus clauses in economics. Economics raises questions concerning the legitimacy of severe abstraction and idealization. For example, mainstream economic models often stipulate that everyone is perfectly rational and has perfect information, or that commodities are infinitely divisible. Such claims are exaggerations, and they are clearly false. Other schools of economics may not employ idealizations that are this extreme, but there is no way to do economics if one is not willing to simplify drastically and abstract from many complications. How much simplification, idealization, abstraction, or isolation Mackey 2006 is legitimate? In addition, because economists attempt to study economic phenomena as constituting a separate domain, influenced only by a small number of causal factors, the claims of economics are true unless ceteris paribus, that is, they are true only if there are no interferences or disturbing causes. What are ceteris paribus clauses, and when if ever are they legitimate in science? Questions concerning ceteris paribus clauses are closely related to questions concerning simplifications and idealizations, since one way to simplify is to suppose that the various disturbing causes or interferences are inactive, and to explore the consequences of some small number of causal factors. These issues and the related question of how well supported economics is by the evidence have been the central questions in economic methodology. They will be discussed further below in Section 3, and elsewhere. 2.5 Causation in Economics and Econometrics. Many important generalizations in economics are causal claims. For example, the law of demand asserts that a price increase will, ceteris paribus, diminish the quantity demanded. It does not merely assert an inverse relationship between price and demand. When demand increases for some other reason, such as a change in tastes, price increases. Econometricians have also been deeply concerned with the possibilities of determining causal relations from statistical evidence, and with the relevance of causal relations to the possibility of consistent estimation of parameter values. Since concerns about the consequences of alternative policies are so central to economics, causal inquiry is unavoidable. Before the 1930s, economists were generally willing to use causal language explicitly and literally, despite some concerns that there might be a conflict between causal analysis of economic changes and comparative statics treatments of equilibrium states. Some economists were also worried that thinking in terms of causes was not compatible with recognizing the multiplicity and mutuality of determination in economic equilibrium. In the anti-metaphysical intellectual environment of the 1930s and 1940s, of which logical positivism was at least symptomatic, any mention of causation became highly suspicious, and economists commonly pretended to avoid causal concepts. The consequence was that they ceased to reflect carefully on the causal concepts that they continued implicitly to invoke. Hausman 1983, 1990, Helm 1984. Runde 1998. For example, rather than formulating the law of demand in terms of the causal consequences of price changes for quantity demanded, economists tried to confine themselves to discussing the mathematical function relating price and quantity demanded. There were important exceptions. Havelmo 1944, Simon 1953, Wold 1954, and during the past generation, this state of affairs has changed dramatically. For example, in his Causality in Macroeconomics, 2001b, Kevin Hoover develops feasible methods for investigating large-scale causal questions, such as whether changes in the money supply, M, cause changes in the rate of inflation, P, or accommodate changes in P that are otherwise caused. If changes in M cause changes in P, then the conditional distribution of P on M should remain stable with exogenous changes in M, but should change with exogenous changes in P. Hoover argues that historical investigation, backed by statistical inquiry, can justify the conclusion that some particular changes in M or P have been exogenous. One can then determine the causal direction by examining the stability of the conditional distributions. Econometricians have made vital contributions to the contemporary revival of philosophical interest in the notion of causation. In addition to Hoover's work, see for example Gewecke, 1982, Granger, 1969, 1980, Cartwright, 1989, Schms, 1977, Zellner and Aigner, 1988, Pearl, 2000, Spirtes, Gleimer, and Shines, 2001. One apparently secure way to determine causal relations is via randomized controlled experiments. If the experimenter sorts subjects randomly into experimental and control groups, and varies just one factor, then unless by bad luck the two groups differ in some unknown way, changes in the outcomes given the common features of the control and treatment groups should be due to the difference in the one factor. This makes randomized controlled trials very attractive, though no panacea. Since the treatment and control groups may not be representative of the population in which policymakers hope to apply the causal conclusions, and the causal consequences of the intervention might differ across different subgroups within the control and treatment groups. Worrall 2007. For both practical and ethical reasons, it is often hard to experiment in economics, though, as discussed in section 4.5, far from impossible. As a substitute for experimentation, in recent years econometricians have become very enthusiastic about so-called instrumental variable techniques. For example, merely examining the correlation between economic growth and development aid, even controlling for other factors known to influence economic growth, is unlikely to reveal the causal influence of aid on growth, because aid may depend on growth, and well as many factors that are hard to measure that also influence growth. But if economists can find some variable x upon which aid depends that influences growth, if at all, only by its influence on aid, and is probabilistically independent of all other determinants of growth, then one can use the effect of x on growth to estimate the effect of aid on growth. Instrumental variable techniques, policy experimentation, and reliance on natural experiments are currently very popular, though also problematic and controversial. Deaton 2010. 2.6 Structure and Strategy of Economics, Paradigms, and Research Programs in the Wake of the Work of Kuhn, 1970, and Lakatos, 1970. Philosophers are much more aware of and interested in the larger theoretical structures that unify and guide research within particular research traditions. Since many theoretical projects or approaches in economics are systematically unified, they pose questions about what guides research, and many economists have applied the work of Kuhn or Lakatos in the attempt to shed light on the overall structure of economics. Baumberg 1977, Blaug 1976, DeMarchi and Blaug 1991, Bronfenbrenner 1971, Coates 1969, Dillard 1978, Hans 1985b. Hausman 1992, Chapter 6. Hutchison 1978, Latsis 1976, Jalado 1978, Kuhn and Weaver 1971, Stanfield 1974, Weintraub 1985, Warland 1972. Whether these applications have been successful is controversial, but the comparison of the structure of economics to Kuhn's and Lakato's schema has at least served to highlight distinctive features of economics. For example, asking what the positive heuristic of mainstream economics consists in permits one to see that mainstream models typically attempt to demonstrate that an economic equilibrium will obtain, and thus, that mainstream models are unified in more than just their common assumptions. Since the success of research projects in economics is controversial, understanding their global structure and strategy may clarify their drawbacks as well as their advantages. 3. Inexactness, ceteris paribus clauses, and unrealistic assumptions. As mentioned in the previous section, the most important methodological issue concerning economics involves the very considerable simplification, idealization, and abstraction that characterizes economic theory, and the consequent doubts these features of economics raise concerning whether economics is well supported. Claims such as, agents prefer larger commodity bundles to smaller commodity bundles, raise serious questions, because if they are interpreted as universal generalizations, they are false. Can a science rest on false generalizations? If these claims are not universal generalizations, then what is their logical form? And how can claims that appear in this way to be false or approximate be tested and confirmed or disconfirmed? These problems have bedeviled economists and economic methodologists from the first methodological reflections to the present day. 3.1 Classical Economics and the Method a priori. The first extended reflections on economic methodology appear in the work of Nassau Sr., 1836, and John Stuart Mill, 1836. Their essays must be understood against the background of the economic theory of their times. Like Smith's economics, to which it owed a great deal, and modern economics, the classical economics of the middle decades of the 19th century traced economic regularities to the choices of individuals facing social and natural constraints. But, as compared to Smith, more reliance was placed on severely simplified models. David Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy, 1817, draws a portrait in which wages above the subsistence level lead to increases in the population, which in turn require more intensive agriculture or cultivation of inferior land. The extension of cultivation leads to lower profits and higher rents, and the whole tale of economic development leads to a gloomy stationary state, in which profits are too low to command any net investment, wages return to subsistence levels, and only the landlords are affluent. Fortunately for the world, but unfortunately for economic theorists at the time, the data consistently contradicted the trends the theory predicted, de Marchi 1970. Yet the theory continued to hold sway for more than half a century, and the consistently unfavorable data were explained away as due to various disturbing causes. It is consequently not surprising that Senior's and Mill's accounts of the method of economics emphasize the relative autonomy of theory. Mill distinguishes between two main kinds of inductive methods. The method de posteriori is a method of direct experience. In his view, it is only suitable for phenomena in which few causal factors are operating, or in which experimental controls are possible. Mill's famous methods of induction provide an articulation of the method de posteriori. In his method of difference, for example, one holds fixed every causal factor except one and checks to see whether the effect ceases to obtain when that one factor is removed. Mill maintains that direct inductive methods cannot be used to study phenomena in which many causal factors are in play. If, for example, one attempts to investigate whether tariffs enhance or impede prosperity by comparing the prosperity of nations with high tariffs and nations without high tariffs, the results will be worthless, because the prosperity of the countries studied depend on so many other causal factors. So, Mill argues, one needs instead to employ the method de priori. Despite its name, this too is an inductive method. The difference between the method de priori and the method de posteriori is that the method de priori is an indirect inductive method. Scientists first determine the laws governing individual causal factors in domains in which Mill's methods of induction are applicable. Having then determined the laws of the individual causes, they investigate their combined consequences deductively. Finally, there is a role for verification of the combined consequences, but owing to the causal complications, this testing has comparatively little weight. The testing of the conclusion serves only as a check on the scientist's deductions and as an indicator of whether there are significant disturbing causes that scientists have not yet accounted for. Mill gives the example of the science of the tides. Physicists determine the law of gravitation by studying planetary motion, in which gravity is the only significant causal factor. Then physicists develop the theory of tides deductively from that law and information concerning the positions and motions of the moon and sun. The implications of the theory will be inexact, and sometimes badly mistaken, because many subsidiary causal factors influence tides. Scientists can by testing the theory uncover mistakes in their deductions and evidence concerning the role of the subsidiary factors. But because of the causal complexity, such testing does little to confirm or disconfirm the law of gravitation, which has already been established. Although Mill does not often use the language of ceteris paribus, his view that the principles or laws of economics hold in the absence of interferences or disturbing causes provides an account of how the principles of economics can be true ceteris paribus. Haussmann 1992, Chapter 8:12. Because economic theory includes only the most important causes and necessarily ignores minor causes, its claims, like claims concerning tides, are inexact. Its predictions will be imprecise and sometimes far off. Mill maintains that it is nevertheless possible to develop and confirm economic theory by studying in simpler domains the laws governing the major causal factors, and then deducing their consequences in more complicated circumstances. For example, the statistical data are ambiguous concerning the relationship between minimum wages and unemployment of unskilled workers, and since the minimum wage has never been extremely high, there are no data about what unemployment would be in those circumstances. On the other hand, everyday experience teaches economists that firms can choose among more or less labor-intensive processes, and that a high minimum wage will make more labor-intensive processes more expensive. On the assumption that firms try to keep their costs down, economists have good though not conclusive reason to believe that a high minimum wage will increase unemployment. in defending a view of economics as in this way inexact and employing the method a priori, Mill was able to reconcile his empiricism and his commitment to Ricardo's economics. Although Mill's views on economic methodology were challenged later in the 19th century by economists who believed that the theory was too remote from the contingencies of policy and history, Rusher 1874, Schmoller 1888, 1898, Mill's methodological views dominated the mainstream of economic theory for well over a century. For example, Cairnes 1875. Mill's vision survived the so-called neoclassical revolution in economics beginning in the 1870s, and is clearly discernible in the most important methodological treatises concerning neoclassical economics, such as John Neville Keynes' The Scope and Method of Political Economy, 1891, or Lionel Robbins' An Essay on the Nature and Significance of Economic Science, 1932. Hausman, 1992, argues that current methodological practice closely resembles Mill's methodology, despite the fact that few economists explicitly defend it. 3.2 Friedman and the defense of unrealistic assumptions. Although some contemporary philosophers have argued that Mill's method a priori is largely defensible, Bhaskar 1978, Cartwright 1989, and Hausman 1992, by the middle of the 20th century Mill's views appeared to many economists out of step with contemporary philosophy of science. Without studying Mill's text carefully, it was easy for economists to misunderstand his terminology and to regard his method a priori, as opposed to empiricism. Others took seriously Mill's view that the basic principles of economics should be empirically established and found evidence to cast doubt on some of the basic principles, particularly the view that firms attempt to maximize profits, Hall and Hitch 1938, Lester 1946, 1947. Methodologists who were well informed about contemporary developments in philosophy of science, such as Terence Hutchison, 1938, denounced pure theory in economics as unscientific. Philosophically reflective economists proposed several ways to replace the old-fashioned Millian view with a more up-to-date methodology that would continue to justify much of current practice. See particularly Matchlop 1955, 1960 and Koopmans 1957. By far the most influential of these was Milton Friedman's contribution in his 1953 essay, The Methodology of Positive Economics. This essay has had an enormous influence, far more than any other work on methodology. Friedman begins his essay by distinguishing in a conventional way between positive and normative economics, and conjecturing that policy disputes are typically really disputes about the consequences of alternatives, and can thus be resolved by progress in positive economics. Turning to positive economics, Friedman asserts, without argument, that correct prediction concerning phenomena not yet observed is the ultimate goal of all positive sciences. He holds a practical view of science, and looks to science for predictions that will guide policy. Since it is difficult, and often impossible to carry out experiments, and since the uncontrolled phenomena economists observe are difficult to interpret, owing to the same causal complexity that bothered Mill, it is hard to judge whether a particular theory is a good basis for predictions, or not. Consequently, Friedman argues, economists have supposed that they could test theories by the realism of their assumptions rather than by the accuracy of their predictions. Friedman argues at length that this is a grave mistake. Theories may be of great predictive value even though their assumptions are extremely unrealistic. The realism of a theory's assumptions is, he maintains, irrelevant to its predictive value. It does not matter whether the assumption that firms maximize profits is realistic. Theories should be appraised exclusively in terms of the accuracy of their predictions. What matters is whether the theory of the firm makes correct and significant predictions. As critics have pointed out, and almost all commentators have been critical, Friedman refers to several different things as assumptions of a theory, and means several different things by speaking of assumptions as unrealistic. Brunner 1969. Since Friedman aims his criticism to those who investigate empirically whether firms in fact attempt to maximize profits, he must take assumptions to include central economic generalizations, such as firms attempt to maximize profits, and by unrealistic, he must mean, among other things, false. In arguing that it is a mistake to appraise theories in terms of the realism of assumptions, Friedman is arguing at least that it is a mistake to appraise theories by investigating whether their central generalizations are true or false. It would seem that this interpretation would render Friedman's views inconsistent, because in testing whether firms attempt to maximize profits, one is checking whether predictions of theory concerning the behavior of firms are true or false. An assumption such as firms maximize profits is itself a prediction. But there is a further wrinkle. Friedman is not concerned with every prediction of economic theories. In Friedman's view, theory is to be judged by its predictive power for the class of phenomena which it is intended to explain. 1953, page 8 italics added. Economists are interested in only some of the implications of economic theories. Other predictions, such as those concerning the results of surveys of managers, are irrelevant to policy. What matters is whether economic theories are successful at predicting the phenomena that economists are interested in. In other words, Friedman believes that economic theory should be appraised in terms of their predictions concerning prices and quantities exchanged on markets. In his view, what matters is narrow predictive success. Houseman 2000 data, not overall predictive adequacy. So economists can't simply ignore the disquieting findings of surveys. They can ignore the fact that people do not always prefer larger bundles of commodities to smaller bundles of commodities. They need not be troubled that some of their models suppose that all agents know the prices of all present and future commodities in all markets. All that matters is whether the predictions concerning market phenomena turn out to be correct. And since anomalous market outcomes could be due to any number of uncontrolled causal factors, while experiments are difficult to carry out, it turns out that economists need not worry about ever encountering evidence that would disconfirm fundamental theory. Detailed models may be confirmed or disconfirmed, but fundamental theory is safe. In this way one can understand how Friedman's methodology, which appears to justify the eclectic and pragmatic view that economists should use any model that appears to work regardless of how absurd or unreasonable its assumptions might appear, has been deployed in service of rigid theoretical orthodoxy. For other discussions of Friedman's essay, see Barrandor 1969, Boland 1979, Hammond 1992, Hershande Marchi 1990, Mackey 1990, Melitz 1963, Rotwein 1959, and Samuelson 1963. Over the last 2 decades there has been a surge of experimentation in economics, and Friedman's methodological views probably do not command the same near unanimity that they used to. But they are still enormously influential, and they still serve as a way of avoiding awkward questions concerning simplifications, idealizations, and abstraction in economics rather than responding to them. 4. Contemporary directions in economic methodology. The past half-century has witnessed the emergence of a large literature devoted to economic methodology. That literature explores many methodological approaches and applies its conclusions to many schools and branches of economics. Much of the literature focuses on the fundamental theory of mainstream economics, the theory of the equilibria resulting from constrained rational individual choice, but macroeconomics has recently attracted increasing interest. Backhouse. Since 1985, there has been a journal Economic and Philosophy devoted specifically to philosophy of economics, and since 1994 there has also been a journal of economic methodology. This section will sample some of the methodological work of the past 2 decades. 4.1 Popperian approaches. Karl Popper's philosophy of science has been influential among economists, as among other scientists. Popper defends what he calls a falsificationist methodology, 1968-1969. Scientists should formulate theories that are logically falsifiable, that is, inconsistent with some possible observation reports. All crows are black is logically falsifiable, since it is inconsistent with, and would be falsified by, an observation report of a red crow. Popper insists on falsifiability on the grounds that unfalsifiable claims that rule out no observations are uninformative. They provide no guidance concerning what to expect. Second, Popper maintains that scientists should subject theories to harsh tests and should be willing to reject them when they fail the tests. Third, scientists should regard theories as at best interesting conjectures. Passing a test does not confirm a theory or provide scientists with reason to believe it. It only justifies continuing to employ it, since it has not yet been falsified, and devoting increased efforts to attempting to falsify it, since it has thus far survived testing. Popper has also written in defense of what he calls situational logic, which is basically rational choice theory, as the correct method for the social sciences, 1967, 1976. There appear to be serious tensions between Popper's falsificationism and his defense of situational logic, and his discussion of situational logic has not been as influential as his falsificationism. For discussion of how situational logic applies to economics, see Hans, 1985a. Given Popper's falsificationism, there seems little hope of understanding how extreme simplifications can be legitimate or how current economic practice could be scientifically reputable. Specific economic theories are rarely logically falsifiable. When they are, the widespread acceptance of Friedman's methodological views ensures that they are not subjected to serious test. When they apparently fail tests, they are rarely repudiated. Economic theories, which have not been well tested, are taken to be well-established guides to policy, rather than merely conjectures. Some critics of neoclassical economics have made these criticisms, Eichner 1983. But most of those who have espoused Popper's philosophy of science have not repudiated mainstream economics, and have not been so harshly critical of its practitioners. Mark Blaug, 1992, and Terence Hutchison, 1938, 1977, 1978, 2000, who are the most prominent Popperian methodologists, criticize particular features of economics, and they both call for more testing and a more critical attitude. For example, Blaug praises Gary Becker, 1976, for his refusal to explain differences in choices by differences in preferences, but criticizes him for failing to go on and test his theories severely, 1980, Chapter 14. However, both Blaug and Hutchison understate the radicalism of Popper's views, and take his message to be little more than that scientists should be critical and concerned to test their theories. Blaug's and Hutchison's criticisms have sometimes been challenged on the grounds that economic theories cannot be tested because of their ceteris paribus clauses and the many subsidiary assumptions required to derive testable implications, Caldwell 1984. But this response ignores Popper's insistence that testing requires methodological decisions, not to attribute failures of predictions to mistakes in subsidiary assumptions, or to interferences. For views of Popper's philosophy and its applicability to economics, see DeMarchi, 1988, Caldwell, 1991, and Boland, 1982, 1989, 1992. Applying Popper's views on falsification literally would be destructive. Not only neoclassical economics, but all known economic theories would be condemned as unscientific, and there would be no way to discriminate among economic theories. One major general problem with a naive reading of Popper's views is that one cannot derive testable implications from theories by themselves. To derive testable implications, one also needs subsidiary assumptions concerning distributions, measurement devices, proxies for unmeasured variables, the absence of various interferences, and so forth. This is the so-called Duhem-Quine problem. Duhem 1906, Quine 1953, Cross 1982. These problems arise generally, and Popper proposes that they be solved by a methodological decision, to regard a failure of the deduced testable implication to be a failure of the theory. But in economics the subsidiary assumptions are dubious, and in many cases known to be false. Making the methodological decision that Popper requires is unreasonable, and would lead one to reject all economic theories. Imre Lakatos, 1970, who was for most of his philosophical career a follower of Popper, offers a broadly Popperian solution to this problem. Lakatos insists that testing is always comparative. When theories face empirical difficulties, as they always do, one attempts to modify them. Scientifically acceptable, in Lakatos' terminology, theoretically progressive modifications must always have some additional testable implications, and are thus not purely ad hoc. If some of the new predictions are confirmed, then the modification is empirically progressive, and one has reason to reject the unmodified theory, and to employ the new theory, regardless of how unsuccessful and generally their theory may be. Though progress may be hard to come by, Lakatos' views do not have the same destructive implications as Popper's. Lakatos appears to solve the problem of how to appraise mainstream economic theory by arguing that what matters is empirical progress or retrogression rather than empirical success or failure. Lakatos' views have thus been more attractive to economic methodologists than Popper's. Developing Thomas Kuhn's notion of a paradigm 1970 and some hints from Popper. Lakatos also developed a view of a global theory structure of whole theoretical enterprises, which he called scientific research programs. Lakatos emphasized that there is a hard core of basic theoretical propositions that define a research program, and are not to be questioned within the research program. In addition, members of a research program accept a common body of heuristics that guide them in the articulation and modification of specific theories. These views have also been attractive to economic methodologists, since theory development in economics is so sharply constrained, and since economics appears at first glance to have a hard core. The fact that economists do not give up basic theoretical postulates that appear to be false might be explained and justified by regarding them as part of the hard core of the neoclassical research program. Yet Lakatos' views do not provide a satisfactory account of how economics can be a reputable science, despite its reliance on extreme simplifications. For it is questionable whether the development of neoclassical economic theory has demonstrated empirical progress. For example, the replacement of cardinal utility theory by ordinal utility theory, see below section 5.1, in the 1930s, which is generally regarded as a major step forward, involved the replacement of one theory by another that was strictly weaker, and which had no additional empirical content. Furthermore, despite his emphasis on heuristics as guiding theory modification, Lakatos still emphasizes testing. Science is for Lakatos more empirically driven, and is contemporary economics, hence 1992. It is also doubtful whether research enterprises in economics have hard cores. Hoover 1991, Houseman 1992, Chapter 6. For attempts to apply Lakatos' views to economics, see Latsis, 1976, and Weintraub, 1985. As is apparent in De Marchian-Blog, 1991, writers on economic methodology have in recent years become increasingly disenchanted with Lakatos' philosophy. There is a second major problem with Popper's philosophy of science, which plagues Lakatos' views as well. Both maintain that there is no such thing as empirical confirmation for some late qualms of Lakatos, see Lakatos 1974. Popper and Lakatos maintain that evidence never provides reason to believe that scientific claims are true, and both also deny that results of tests can justify relying on statements in practical endeavors or in theoretical inquiry. There is no better evidence for one unfalsified proposition, and for another. Someone who questions whether there is enough evidence for some proposition to justify relying on it in theoretical studies or for policy purposes would be making the methodological error of supposing that there can be evidence in support of hypotheses. With the notable exception of Watkins, 1984, few philosophers within the Popperian tradition have faced up to this challenge in consequence. 4. To the rhetoric of economics. One radical reaction to the difficulties of justifying the reliance on severe simplifications is to deny that economics passes methodological muster. Alexander Rosenberg, 1992, maintains that economics can only make imprecise generic predictions, and it cannot make progress, because it is built around folk psychology, which is a mediocre theory of human behavior, and which, owing to the irreducibility of intentional notions, cannot be improved. Complex economic theories are valuable only as applied mathematics, not as empirical theory. Since economics does not show the same consistent progress as the natural sciences, one cannot dismiss Rosenberg's suggestion that economics is an empirical dead end. But his view that it has made no progress, and that it does not permit quantitative predictions, is hard to accept. For example, contemporary economists are much better at pricing stock options than economists were even a generation ago. An equally radical but opposite reaction is Deirdre McCloskey's, who denies that there are any non-trivial methodological standards that economics must meet, 1985, 1994. In her view, the only relevant and significant criteria for assessing the practices and products of a discipline are those accepted by the practitioners. Apart from a few general standards such as honesty and a willingness to listen to criticisms, the only justifiable criteria for any conversation are those of the participants. Economists can thus dismiss arrogant pretensions of philosophers to judge economic discourse. Whatever a group of respected economists takes to be good economics is automatically good economics. Philosophical standards of empirical success are just so much hot air. Those who are interested in understanding the character of economics and in contributing to its improvement should eschew methodology and study instead the rhetoric of economics, that is, the means of argument and persuasion that succeed among economists. McCloskey's studies of the rhetoric of economics have been valuable and influential. 1985, ESP. Chapter 5-7. But much of her work consists not of such studies, but of philosophical critiques of economic methodology. These are more problematic because the position sketched in the previous paragraph is hard to defend and potentially self-defeating. It is hard to defend because epistemological standards for good science have already infected the conversation of economists. The standards of predictive success which lead one to have qualms about economics are already standards that many economists accept. The only way to escape these doubts is to surrender the standards that gave rise to them. But McCloskey's position undermines any principled argument for a change in standards. Furthermore, as Alexander Rosenberg has argued, 1988, it seems that economists would doom themselves to irrelevance if they were to surrender standards of predictive success, for it is upon such standards that policy decisions are made. McCloskey does not, in fact, want to preclude all criticisms that economists are sometimes persuaded when they should not be, or are not persuaded when they should be. For she herself criticizes the bad habit some economists have of conflating statistical significance with economic importance. 1985, Chapter 9. Sometimes McCloskey characterizes rhetoric descriptively as the study of what in fact persuades, but sometimes she characterizes it normatively as the study of what ought to persuade. 1985, Chapter 2. And if rhetoric is the study of what ought rationally to persuade, then it is methodology, not an alternative to methodology. Questions about whether economics is a successful empirical science cannot be conjured away. 4.3 Realism in Economic Methodology. Economic methodologists have paid little attention to debates within philosophy of science between realists and anti-realists. Van Frossen 1980, Boyd 1984. Because economic theories rarely postulate the existence of unobservable entities or properties, apart from variants of everyday unobservables, such as beliefs and desires. Methodologists have, on the other hand, vigorously debated the goals of economics, but those who argue that the ultimate goals are predictive, such as Milton Friedman, do so because of their interest in policy, not because they seek to avoid or resolve epistemological and semantic puzzles concerning references to unobservables. Nevertheless, there are two important recent realist programs in economic methodology. The first, developed mainly by Oskali Mackey, is devoted to exploring the varieties of realism implicit in the methodological statements and theoretical enterprises of economists. See Mackey 1990 FB, c. 2007. The second, which is espoused by Tony Lawson and his co-workers, mainly at Cambridge University, derives from the work of Roy Bhaskar, 1978, C. Lawson 1997, Bhaskar et al. 1998, and Fleetwood 1999. In Lawson's view, one can trace many of the inadequacies of mainstream economics, of which he is a critic, to an insufficient concern with ontology. In attempting to identify regularities on the surface of the phenomena, mainstream economists are doomed to failure. Economic phenomena are in fact influenced by a large number of different causal factors, and one can achieve scientific knowledge only of the underlying mechanisms and tendencies, whose operation can be glimpsed intermittently and obscurely in observable relations. Mackey's and Lawson's programs obviously have little to do with one another, though Mackey, like Mill, Cartwright, and Hausman, shares Lawson's and Bhaskar's concern with underlying causal mechanisms. See also the entry on scientific realism. 4.4 Economic methodology and social studies of science throughout its history. economics has been the subject of sociological as well as methodological scrutiny. Many sociological discussions of economics, like Marx's critique of classical political economy, have been concerned to identify ideological distortions and thereby to criticize particular aspects of economic theory and economic policy. Since every political program finds economists who testify to its economic virtues, there is never-ending source of material for such critiques. For example, in the wake of the near collapse of the international financial system in 2008, American economists who argued for austerity were mostly Republicans, while those who defended efforts to increase aggregate demand were mostly Democrats. The influence of contemporary sociology of science and social studies of science, coupled with the difficulties methodologists have had making sense of and rationalizing the conduct of economics, have led to a sociological turn within methodological reflection itself. Rather than showing that there is good evidence supporting developments in economic theory, or that those developments have other broadly epistemic virtues, methodologists and historians such as D. Wade Hans, 2001, Hans and Mirowski 1998, Philip Mirowski, 2002, and E. Roy Weintraub, 1991, have argued that these changes reflect a wide variety of non-rational factors, from changes in funding for theoretical economics, political commitments, personal rivalries, attachments to metaphors, or mathematical interests. Furthermore, many of the same methodologists and historians have argued that economics is not only an object of social inquiry, but that it can be a tool of social inquiry. By studying the incentive structure of scientific disciplines and the implicit or explicit market forces impinging on research, including of course research in economics, it should be possible to write the economics of science and the economics of economics itself. Hans 1995, Hall 1988, Leonard 2002, Mirowski and Sent 2002. Exactly how, if at all, this work is supposed to bear on questions concerning how well supported are the claims economists make is not clear. Though eschewing traditional methodology, Mirowski's monograph on the role of physical analogy in economics, 1990, is often very critical of mainstream economics. In his Reflection Without Rules, 2001, D. W. Hans maintains that general methodological rules are of little use. He defends a naturalistic view of methodology, and is skeptical of prescriptions that are not based on detailed knowledge. But he does not argue that no rules apply. 4.5 Detailed contemporary studies. The above survey of approaches to the fundamental problems of appraising economic theory is far from complete. For example, there have been substantial efforts to apply structuralist views of scientific theories, Snead 1971, Stegmüller 1976, 1979, to economics, Stegmüller, et al. 1981, Huminga 1983, Hans 1985 c. Balzer, and Huminga 1989. The above discussion does at least document the diversity and disagreements concerning how to interpret and appraise economic theories. It is not surprising that there is no consensus among those writing on economic methodology concerning the overall empirical appraisal of specific approaches in economics, including mainstream microeconomics, macroeconomics, and econometrics. When practitioners cannot agree, it is questionable whether those who know more philosophy, but less economics will be able to settle the matter. Since the debates continue, those who reflect on economic methodology should have a continuing part to play. Meanwhile, there are many other more specific methodological questions to address, and it is a sign of the maturity of the subdiscipline that a large and increasing percentage of work on economic methodology addresses more specific questions. There is plethora of work, as a perusal of any recent issue of the Journal of Economic Methodology or Economics and Philosophy will confirm. Some of the range of issues currently under discussion were mentioned above in Section 2. Here is a list of 3 of the many areas of current interest. 1. Although more concerned with the content of economics than with its methodology, the recent explosion of work on feminist economics is shot through with methodological and sociological self-reflection. The fact that a larger percentage of economists are men, and is true of any of the other social sciences, and indeed that several of the natural sciences raises methodological questions about whether there is something particularly masculine about the discipline. Important texts are Ferber and Nelson, 1993, 2003, Nelson, 1995, 1996, 2001, Barker and Kuiper, 2003. Since 1995, there has been a journal, Feminist Economics, which pulls together much of this work. 2. A century ago, economists talked of their work in terms of principles, laws, and theories. Nowadays, the standard intellectual two-law form is a model. Is this just a change in terminological fashion, or does the concern with models signal a methodological shift? What are models? These questions have been discussed by Cartwright 1989, 1999, Godfrey Smith 2006, Krunyanov 2009, Hausman 1992, Kworykowski and Layton in 2009, Mackey, ed. 1991, Mackey 2009, 2009b. Morgan 2001, 2004, Morgan and Morrison 1999, Rappaport 1998, Sugden 2000, 2009, and Weisberg 2007. 3. During the past generation, experimental work in economics has expanded rapidly. This work has many different objectives, Siroth 1988, and apparently holds out the prospect of bridging the gulf between economic theory and empirical evidence. Some of it casts light on the way in which methodological commitments influence the extent to which economists heed empirical evidence. For example, in the case of preference reversals, discussed briefly below in section 5.1, economists devoted considerable attention to the experimental findings and conceded that they disconfirmed central principles of economics. But economists were generally unwilling to pay serious attention to the theories proposed by psychologists that predicted the phenomena before they were observed. The reason seems to be that these psychological theories do not have the same wide scope as the basic principles of mainstream economics. Hausman 1992, Chapter 13. The methodological commitments governing theoretical economics are much more complex and much more specific to economics, and the general rules proposed by philosophers such as Popper and Lakatos. The relevance of experimentation remains controversial. Behavioral economists are most enthusiastic, while more traditional theorists question whether experimental findings can be generalized to non-experimental contexts, and, more generally, concerning the possibilities of learning from experiments, Kaplan and Schotter 2008. For discussions of experimental economics, see Koala 2000, b. 2005, Hay, 1991, Kagel and Roth, 1995, 2008, Plot, 1991, Smith, 1991, Starmer, 1999, Kammerer, 2003, and the June 2005 special issue of the Journal of Economic Methodology. Roth's Game Theory, Experimental Economics, and Market Design page, http://cosnets.fas.harvard.edu/tilde/Allroth HTML, is a particularly useful source